The man began to say that it was time to rest, because they had already achieved a lot. This awakened in the children memories of the mysterious miss, which turned out to be not a place, but a transformation of their inner world. Last week it all started with an unusual silence. It penetrated the house, spread through the rooms, settled on the shelves, lay between steps and glances. No one spoke directly, but everyone noticed he had changed. His steps became slower, his movements calmer, and his eyes no longer searched the air for another idea that needed to be implemented. He began to sit in place longer, staring at the ceiling or the window, as if some new reality was opening there, inaccessible to others. Everything used to be different. The house was like a mechanism, where everyone played their role, and everyone lived to the rhythm of his thoughts. When he invented something, everyone picked it up. When he built, they built with him. When he wanted more, everyone wanted more. His energy pushed everyone to move, to act, to achieve results. But now everything had changed. The silence did not bring peace. It pressed, and alerted. At first, the children did not pay attention. They continued to play, study, argue, and laugh as always. But then they stopped too. Not because someone forced them to. They simply noticed how the space had changed. Sounds became muffled, as if they were being muffled by an invisible blanket. Things remained in their places longer than they should. The morning sun penetrated the windows, but did not bring the same feeling of a new beginning. One evening, the children sat together, without words. They silently went through their memories. They remembered Miss, they did not quite understand what it was, but a bright imprint remained in their memory. Not an image, not an event, but some kind of feeling. As if they had all once been together in a place where things were different. Where was the laughter, the excitement, the anticipation of something extraordinary? They recalled without haste, feeling how with every minute the picture in their heads became clearer. The missus did not look like a house. It had no walls or ceiling. It was a space that lived with them. They could not say whether it was a house, a camp, a playground, or something completely different. But it definitely existed. They were all there. And he was there too. Only there he was completely different. Not calm and silent, like now. But inspired, smiling, enthusiastic. He taught them, showed them, created. It was there that it all began. After these memories, the house became even quieter. The children began to look at it differently. They no longer saw their father, who was tired. They saw a person who had returned from a very long journey. Not literally, but internally. As if he had gone through something important that they did not yet understand. He no longer sought new goals, did not rush them or demand anything. He simply was, but something remained unspoken. Not a question, not a problem, more like a shadow of something forgotten. Like a piece in a puzzle that does not fit anywhere, but still seems familiar. Every night before going to bed, the children began to remember Mississippi. Someone saw a green meadow, someone a tower of transparent glass. Someone remembered a ringing laugh, another a sound that rolled loudly in the air. With each memory, more details emerged. The sandy beach where they sat in a circle. A book without pages from which you could read thoughts. A room that changed shape depending on your mood. All this was somewhere there, in that Mississippi. They no longer doubted Miss existed. And they had to return there. Night awakenings began. Someone woke up in tears, someone with a smile. Everyone felt a strange excitement, as if they were about to embark on a long journey. He saw everything, but said nothing. He continued to sit silently by the window, sometimes closing his eyes, sometimes drawing something on the table with his finger. His presence was like a beacon in the fog, silent, but tangible. Point one of the children decided to get an old box from the basement. It contained all the little things that had once seemed important. Paper airplanes, colored ribbons, wooden figures, scraps of fabric from which they had once sewn something for a game. They looked at these things, touched them, inhaled the smells of the past. And with each little thing, Miss became closer. No one spoke her name out loud. She existed only in thoughts, in memories, in the soft light of the mornings and the foreboding of change. They knew something had to happen. Miss didn't just remember. She was calling. And everyone felt it. The house hadn't changed yet, but the tension in the air had changed. It no longer pressed. It smoldered like heat under ashes. They waited. They didn't know what, but they knew for sure that they wouldn't have to wait long. The morning after the memories, everything was quiet, as always. But the silence was no longer frightening. It became a kind of whisper, an invisible thread that connected memories, glances, and touches. The children began to act. Without any plan, without discussion, just to act. One of them took out an old map on which they had once drawn imaginary routes. Another opened a cupboard where boxes with signatures that no one had read for a long time were kept. All of this had once mattered, and now it was coming back from the past, as if waiting for this very moment. They began to remember not just Miss, but moments connected with her. One morning, when someone woke up before dawn, and the fog outside the window was so thick that it seemed alive. One day, when the wind brought voices, not words, not screams, but voices, as if someone was speaking in another dimension. And the more they remembered, the more such episodes appeared. They were all with Mississippi. Although at that time they did not understand where they were. Miss changed every day. There were no rules there. She breathed like a living being. She opened herself to those who were ready, not with the mind, but with the heart. And he understood it. Then first, he showed them how not to be afraid of what could not be explained. He knew how to listen to space. And now, when he was silent, they understood. To listen is to remember. The children began to create from what they found. They built small towers from boxes, passages between rooms from ropes, lanterns from sheets of paper. They didn't say it was construction or play. They just knew it had to be done. Every little thing became an element of something bigger. The floor in the hallway turned into a path. An old ladder into an entrance to the upper space. And a small toy without a head became the guardian of an imaginary passage. All this seemed meaningless from the outside, but inside it meant little. And the longer they built, the more clearly they felt Miss was coming back. He was silent, watching. There was no surprise in his gaze. Rather, it was calm recognition. He saw them, remembering. He didn't interfere, because he knew that if he said even a word, everything could disappear. Miss didn't like noise. She grew in silence, like a plant that shouldn't be touched. He no longer needed to lead her, they walked on their own. And he remained in place, like a watchman in an old tower that remembered the times when the door was still opened. In a room that no one had used for a long time, they found an old lantern. It had not been lit for many years, but one of the children pressed the button and a faint flicker appeared. As if confirmation, yes, you are on the right path. Everyone looked at each other. Without words, but with the same feeling. Something was moving. They spent the whole day as if in a trance. No one ate, no one complained. There was no fatigue, no time. They simply Created. They built, connected, opened, excavated. Instead of doors, passages appeared. Instead of walls, curtains that swayed as if they were breathing. In the evening, the house no longer looked familiar. There was something different in it. Not magic, something deeper. Echo of the moon. When night fell, everyone gathered in one room. A lamp on the ceiling was spinning, projecting stars, an old child's toy. The stars slid along the walls, and everyone recognized their own. Because these stars were also from Mississippi. They never shone the same. Each one corresponded to one of them. And now they were here again. He was sitting in the corner, his head propped up on his arm. His eyes were half closed, but his smile was clear. And then one of the children asked if he remembered. He didn't answer. But not because he didn't want to. The words were just unnecessary. Everyone understood that he remembered. He had no doubts left, no fear. Only readiness. They sat like that for a long time. They didn't sleep. They didn't expect anything specific. But they knew that tomorrow would be different. Because the mist had already opened one of the windows. And it only depended on them whether they could get through it. At 3 in the morning there was a click. The old wardrobe, which they had never been able to open, moved forward and opened. Inside was a passage. A real one. Dark, paneled with wood, with the breath of wind inside. As soon as the door opened, everything around froze. The space ceased to be familiar. The house ceased to be a home. And they were just children. One by one they approached the passage. No one spoke. They simply touched the walls, breathed in the air. Listened to the noise of something deep down. The passage was narrow, but there was no fear in it. Only expectation. And somewhere deep down, confidence. He did not move. He looked at them and nodded. Without emotion, without drama. Simple movements that meant more than any speech. They understood, he was not coming with them. Because he was already there. Always had been. The first took a step. Then the second. Then all of them. When the last one disappeared into the passage, the closet closed. And everything around became quiet again. There was no light in the new space, no noise. But there was a pulse. Like the heart of the earth. And everyone felt it. They stood in the dark, but they knew that something important was ahead. They walked silently, in the darkness that was not frightening. It was not the darkness that hides danger, but the darkness that waits for you to remember yourself. There were no corners in the passage, but there was no straight path either. They walked one after the other, and neither of them turned back. It seemed that they had been here before, not in dreams, not in imagination, but in reality. Each echo of a step brought back fragments of events in memory, how someone jumped over stones, how someone's hand reached for the door, how they laughed, shouted, fell, ran, all without names or details, but with a sense of absolute reality. The passage began to change. At first, barely noticeable lights appeared, like fireflies that kept their distance. They shone just enough to see the walls. And they were no longer made of wood. They were made of fabric. Dense, breathing, like the skin of a living being. They pulsed in time with the steps. And the longer they walked, the more the wall began to change. The outlines of symbols appeared. Lines as if left by a child's fingers in clay. The first one stopped when a fork appeared in front of him. But not the one where they had to choose a path. It was different. Each direction led into themselves, into their own memory, into their own past. But to go further, they had to go through what was held deepest in their memory. They didn't have to explain to each other what to do. They just knew. One of them stepped into the left passage and immediately found himself in a room where music was playing. It flowed from the air, filling everything. He was very small, standing in the middle of the room and trying to say something, but no one heard. Everyone was laughing, greeting, hugging each other, and he was as if transparent. It was a memory. And he had to go through it again. But now not to run away, to stand. Look. Accept. He did so, and the walls dissolved. He returned to the passage. The other found himself in a dark basement where he had once hidden the box of his fear. There was a drawing in which he had depicted something huge, black, with empty eyes. It seemed to him that it was a monster, but now, returning there, he saw that it was loneliness. He touched the drawing, and it crumbled to dust. The passage opened. Each of them walked through his shadow. Some met themselves in despair, some in anger, some in silence. But none stopped. All returned changed. Not older, not stronger, just more whole. When everyone gathered, the passage ahead widened. They emerged into a space that had no walls. The sky above them pulsed with soft light, and the earth was transparent, like glass through which the stars could be seen. In the middle stood a table. Nothing on it. They came closer and saw, on the table were not objects, but their reflections. But not ordinary ones. They were as they had seen themselves in childhood. Some as heroes. Some as wizards. Some as scientists. These images smiled at them. And in that moment they understood, the missus was not just a place. It was a promise of what you could become. And what you could still be. Then there was a sound. At first, a barely audible ringing, like a string being pulled. Then, like a voice speaking words without speech. They didn't understand the meaning, but everyone knew it was time to decide. Because miss is not just a memory. It's a door. And if it opens, it never closes. He appeared again. He was standing on the other side of the table. Still the same, calm, silent. But his gaze was different. Now there was depth in it. He didn't speak, he just looked at everyone. And everyone felt, the moment had come. Miss called, but she didn't pull. She didn't force, she didn't demand. She opened only to those who were ready. And now she was completely open. But beyond that, the unknown. Complete. Without guarantees. One of the children stepped forward. The ground beneath his feet didn't crack, didn't change. But a light appeared in his eyes. He was no longer a child. Not because he had grown up. And because he remembered who he was. The next one was a girl who had been silent about what she was afraid of all her life. She took a step and her shadow disappeared. Then another and another. One by one. They stepped forward, dissolving in space, but not disappearing. They remained, but no longer here. And each step was not an escape, but a return. One remained. The youngest. He stood for a long time. He looked into the face of the one who was waiting. And he did not understand why his heart was beating so fast. And then he understood, the fear of not leaving, but the fear of losing himself if he stayed. He took a step and the world around him exploded with light. After the flash, they found themselves in a space that had neither walls nor a roof. The sky was soft and shapeless, without color, without light, but not dark. There Was nothing under their feet, but they stood firmly, as if supported by something greater than the ground. The air was thick, as if you could touch it, and with each breath it filled their chests with a certainty that was hard to explain. Shapes began to appear around them. Not concrete buildings or trees, but memories in the form of objects that appeared and disappeared, pulsated, lived. Some of them looked familiar: a creaky bed, a painted table, an old toy, a worn backpack. Others were abstract: a ball of light, a kaleidoscopic surface, a slowly dancing shadow. None of this was a hallucination. Each object had an emotional weight that they felt on a physical level. The mist as they remembered it no longer existed. It was no longer just a location, but a manifestation of collective memory. It was made up of their childhood fantasies, fears, dreams, moments of loss and wonder. And it responded. With just one glance, everything changed. The forms became clearer, the outlines deeper, the space more voluminous. Words were not needed here, thought was enough. A lake appeared ahead. It was round, perfect, with water that did not reflect light, but trembled with each approach. Their bodies were reflected not externally, but essentially. Each saw himself not as he was, but as he could have become if he had not betrayed himself. Not better, not worse, different. Another life, different choices, a different essence. The lake did not judge. It showed. After that, figures began to appear around them. They had no clear features, but they were all familiar. Ghostly figures of relatives, friends, lost or forgotten. They did not move, did not pay attention, just stood like markers of memory. And again, the mist did not allow interaction. She wouldn't let the past go back, only to live it again, on a different level. From a different angle. Gradually, the figures began to dissolve, and in their place appeared clumps of light. They rose upward, rising like slow comets. Each such clump was an emotion that had lost its form: childish delight, forgotten sadness, shame left after an unsuccessful deed, warm longing for something that could no longer be returned. All these feelings filled the space. All were parts of Mississippi. Their bodies began to change again. Not physically, energetically. The feeling of presence became too deep, as if every cell had become a conductor. Miss entered them, or they entered Miss. There was no longer any difference. The boundary between the inner and the outer was disappearing. Then a structure appeared. A geometric shape, similar to a tower, but not made of stone, made of information flows. Lines that intersected in perfect symmetry, symbols that flickered, not demanding understanding, only acceptance. This construction had no beginning and no end. It existed in itself. And everyone who looked at it understood that they were seeing a map. Not of the world, but of themselves. All the paths they had taken, all the turns, doubts, flashes, fears, all this was woven into a single pattern. One by one they approached the structure. And each, touching it, saw not events but connections. How one choice led to another. How a moment of silence could change an entire life. How everything that seemed random had its place in an ordered chaos. They felt no shame or pride, only clarity. When the last one touched the structure, it disappeared. And with it, space. And now they stood in darkness. But not the kind that scares. The darkness of the beginning. I and this emptiness. There was nothing but bodies. And the bodies were no longer the same. They were light, free of fear. Not fearless, but ready. They expected nothing, they just walked. And this movement was not a run, it was not a journey. It was an acceptance. Miss was left behind. But at the same time, she was everywhere. She did not disappear, she became a part of everyone. For after passing through it, there was no longer any division into outer and inner. All that had been and all that would be had merged, the light appeared again ahead. But not as a road. Like a dissolution. They did not disappear into it, they became it. And when everything was finally filled with radiance, there was peace. Not the end, the completion. The darkness they had entered was not frightening. It had no weight, no form. It was calm, soft, and quiet. There was no loneliness in this silence, only a sense of completion, as if all the threads had been woven, all the answers found. They no longer looked around. Everything they needed was already within them. The mist had not dissolved, it had become a part of their being, hidden in the deepest layers of consciousness. The bodies moved forward, not touching the surface. Their legs no longer carried their weight, because the body had no gravity. They floated. And every movement was precise, though without purpose. For the first time since the beginning of the journey, there was no fear, no expectation, no questioning. Only movement remained, like breathing. Of the first flash appeared ahead. It was tiny, almost imperceptible, but clearly felt. It was not the eye that saw it, the heart. The flash grew, throbbed, attracted. And as they drew closer, everything around them began to tremble. Space no longer held its shape, it began to crumble, break, bend. The echo of the past trembled in the air, and with it everything they had lived through. One by one, as if on command, they stopped. The pulsating spot ahead stopped growing and turned into a hole. It had no edges, no depth, but it pulled. It pulled not with force, it pulled with truth. In it was what remained on the other side, the world they had once touched but no longer belonged to it. This was the place where the journey began. The first one set off. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look back. He passed through the opening and disappeared. Behind him, the others. All of them. One by one. Body after body. Consciousness after consciousness. Space filled with the whisper of movement. As if the wind was passing through a forest of memories. And when the last one crossed the line, the opening closed. The darkness became solid again, and then everything stopped. No space, no time, no body. Only knowledge remained. The same thing for which the journey had begun. They were no longer there, in the sense of separateness. But each one existed. The truth turned out to be simple, there was no need to go anywhere to find the answer. The answer was to return with a new vision, and that is exactly what happened. The eyes opened. But they were not the same eyes. Not children's, not adults, not tired. They were eyes that saw the world differently. They were sitting on the floor, in a room without clocks, without mirrors, without doors. Everything around them looked familiar, but slightly shifted. The walls had not changed, they had. The bodies moved slowly. Every gesture was deliberate. There was a sense of concentration, silence, depth. They did not seek explanations, they no longer needed them. Now everything was in its place. The world as it had been before remained there, in the past. But they had not returned to it. They had returned to something similar, but no longer the same. They got up. Someone first looked out the window. Not because something called for a look, just a gesture, like a reflex, like a reality check. It was daytime outside the window. Ordinary trees, sky, voices somewhere in the distance. But the day was not the same as before. Everything had the flavor of the first time the movement began. Without words, without a plan. Someone took a book. Someone went to the garden. Someone simply sat on the porch. But clarity was read in every movement. After returning from the mist, there was no longer any possibility of living the old way. And not because someone forced them to, but because the old had lost its meaning, and then, when it seemed that everything had stabilized, the first crack appeared. As if something thin had broken. Then a second. The floor trembled underfoot. The walls stretched slightly. The air thickened. Everything around began to breathe. The beginning was repeated. But this time it was different. The mist was no longer a separate world. It began to sprout here. Its echoes appeared in every corner of the familiar world. Things began to change. The mirrors showed deeper versions of themselves. The walls breathed with memories. Objects spoke not with voice but with essence, and then it became clear, the mist was not a place. It was an awakening. Not a separate reality, but a part of this one. It did not disappear, it seeped into everything. Now it was everywhere, and those who returned were no longer travelers. They became carriers. They are those who remember but do not become attached. Those who see but do not stop. Those who carry the mist with every step, without looking back at the world did not notice the changes. But it began to change. Slowly. Gradually. Like a drop that sharpens a stone. Like a breath that moves dust. Like a memory that does not fade, and it was in this slowness that the main thing was, an invisible transformation that begins not from the outside, but from the inside. They no longer waited. They acted.